Yeah.
Welcome.
I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry I'm not there. And blame COVID. It's the bane of all of our lives, isn't it?
So I think you're.
Claire's arrived. Hi, Claire. This is Mike. We've got a horrible flickering camera for some reason here. So we might turn our camera off, but I'm here with Paul Newton, and you can probably see a bunch of people in the room. So I'll let Paul do a quick intro, and then I hope the Teams has worked out so that you can see the slide share thing. But then we can hear people fine.
Super. Hi, everyone. Nice to see everyone in the room. I'm sorry I'm not there.
Hi, Claire. This is Paul.
Hi, Paul.
Hi. Thanks so much for still being able to give the talk. I hope you're doing okay. So delighted that you can give a talk to us all, and followed by discussion on the anthropology of AMR. Just say a few brief words to introduce Claire. So Claire is Professor of Medical Anthropology at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, where she co-founded the AMR Centre to bring together scholarship across different disciplines from around the world on the challenges of AMR. Her research is focused on medicines, diagnostics, and healthcare in resource-limited settings. And it's primarily ethnographic, but also incorporates historical, epidemiological, and interventional approaches. Her long-term research has taken place in East and Southern Africa. She's also led studies in West Africa and Southeast Asia. She has a keen interest in capacity strengthening, both in practice and as a research topic. She's provided technical advice to the UK government, European Parliament, UN, and other transnational agencies, LMIC governments, and the media on topics including Ebola, malaria, and AMR. And Claire's also leading the social science part of the large FIBRA project that some of us here are part of as well. So thank you very, very much, Claire, for your talk and discussion. I think we'll be ready to start, if that's okay, Mike.
Yeah, we'll hand over to you, Claire. I'll turn our camera off to avoid giving people a headache.
Thanks, Claire. Over to you.
Super. Can you see my slides okay?
Yes. Yes.
And it's in full screen, or are you seeing my presenter?
We're seeing full screen.
Brilliant. And can I just check how long you want me to talk for? How long? What's the end of our session time?
Well, I think we booked a full hour and a half.
Yes.
Including lots of Q&A, but I know you've got, or just recovering from COVID, so
oh yes,
at your own pace.
Still got it going strong, unfortunately. It's just one of those gifts that keeps giving. Anyway, so as long as we're not interrupted by my sick child, we should be fine. So I'm going to give a talk about, well, I can't cover the whole anthropology of antimicrobial resistance, unfortunately, in this time, but I thought I would focus particularly on antibiotics, and particularly on antibiotic use at the kind of community level, the resident level. So I've got 4 kind of sections to the talk that I've prepared. I'm going to start by just kind of talking a bit about, introducing the sort of framing the way that we have been thinking about this problem. Then talking a bit about the anthropology of AMR research group that we've had going for a few years at the school. And then I want to kind of focus on a particular case study or set of case studies from our AMR project in Uganda. And then draw out a few conclusions for research, conclusions for the way that we might address the problems of AMR and antimicrobial use. I was tempted to do a talk on stewardship, including hospital and health facility experiences of AMR and rational drug use. And I'd love to include a bit more about AMR itself and how that's experienced by different people, particularly marginalised groups. I'd also have liked to have included more work from on different study areas, but the depth and breadth question. So I decided to go today with a focus on our AMR Uganda work. And in particular, trying to trace out a particular kind of thread between our case studies there around entrepreneurship. And so I hope, aside from that, that I can do justice to some of the important themes that are emerging from our collective research on the anthropology of AMR and raise some questions for the group. And illustrate as well, one thing that I would like to do is illustrate some of the approaches that anthropologists use for those in the room and online who aren't anthropologists. So, starting out with AMR, the kind of problem that AMR is. Often AMR is constructed as a problem of a lack of antibiotics. So if we can find the right incentives, economic and regulatory models, then more antibiotics will come and save us from a world where our infections can no longer be reliably and quickly treated with effective and widely available medicines. But if we have more antibiotics, will the problem of resistance be solved? I think there's consensus that stoking the antibiotic pipeline only partly solves the problem, and only temporarily. Creating effective new antibiotics that will not rapidly succumb to resistance is a tall order, and it's clear that once we have new antibiotics, we need to manage them very carefully. Therefore, the ways that we use and steward antibiotics needs to change to preserve future drug effectiveness. But more than this, antimicrobial resistance raises our awareness of just how embedded antibiotics have become in our societies, which I'll talk about today, and how they've come to shore up particular ways that humans are in the world. As we begin to see antibiotic treatment failure becoming more commonplace, we start to realise how much else is at risk of being undone. This should alert us to the need to reduce our reliance on antimicrobials, not only to preserve them, but also to make us more resilient to their loss. So as we know, antibiotics were once very rare and difficult to dispense, but we now see them as ubiquitous. Since the 1940s, they've expanded their reach around the world and into all areas of our lives, whether we realise it or not. One way was through their application in a range of different uses, for example, with throat sweets. So you can see here antibiotics literally as sweets, and a double antibiotic action, not just one, but two safe proven antibiotics to kill many irritation-causing throat germs on contact. If we fast forward to today, we know that antibiotics as sweets is something that is now being discouraged. And it's now commonly recognised that antibiotics are in many places, or antibiotics are everywhere. Indeed, I argue that resistance has caused a point of inversion where these substances that were previously hidden like part of the woodwork have now become more apparent. They're not only used in the case of human infections in hospitals or at home, they're used for companion animals, farm animals, crops. They pass through people into the environment, impacting human and non-human bodies. The runoffs from pharmaceutical manufacture also pass back into our systems, affecting microbial communities, as well as the rivers and lakes that form a source of consumption for humans and others. As an anthropologist, I'm interested in the ways that this has come to be and how we've come to take these substances for granted and how they enable forms of production, standardization, and political economies more broadly. So this brings us to this idea that antibiotics have become infrastructural. They've enabled us to live in particular ways. The layouts of our buildings, the number of beds in a ward, the turnover of patients, the number of chickens or pigs in a barn, the number of people in an informal settlement or refugee camp. These have all been made possible with access to antibiotics. They enable surgeries and cancer treatment as preventative measures for potential infection, and they've shored up the authority of the medical and veterinary professions and forms of relations with publics. They also enable a fast pace of life, enabling people to get back to work or not stop working if you or a child is sick, which is particularly required in scenarios of day wage labour. They help us to keep pace with a sense of urgency and perpetual progression. They are part of what it means to be modern and progressive. They enable us to operate at scales of production and standardisation that become possible through their blanket use. They condense time, they enable productivity, and they are an insurance for political decisions. Just to look at one of these dimensions, productivity, it's pertinent to note that the projections of the economic impact of AMR in the O'Neill report, and this one is one of the earlier reports from 2014, are premised quite a lot on the lost productivity of populations due to AMR. This is significant because it demonstrates how entangled antibiotics currently are with our workforce, such that in the face of their loss, economists anticipate huge loss of workers able to contribute to the workforce. So people are falling out of the workforce for having AMR, or they're having to be replaced because they die of a drug-resistant infection in this model, and that's what ends up costing these enormous amounts to the global economy. So when this infrastructure fails, we start to see it. Like when water pipes leak or we have power outages, we become more aware of the infrastructure of pipes, cables, and sources of water and energy. In the case of drug resistance, as drugs lose their efficacy and we're no longer able to treat diseases so quickly and easily, we start to see how infrastructural these antibiotics have become. Another way to think about this is the ways that antibiotics have become a quick fix. They provide a shortcut for reaching goals which otherwise might require more difficult changes. For example, in settings where clinicians have limited time or it's hard to access a clinician, the provision of medical care has become reduced to accessing medicines, and antibiotics are a powerful emblem of biomedicine. In many places where I work in Africa, if there are no medicines at the clinic, there is no point in going for treatment. So here, care has been reduced to the provision of medicines. We're able to see how antibiotics then have come to fix systemic problems, and we draw attention to these systems that need to be addressed if we're no longer to rely on antibiotics. So with that as a backdrop, I'd like to talk a bit about our anthropology of AMR research that we've been doing. So from about 2016, we developed a team of researchers from different countries around the world collaborating on research that looks at the challenges of AMR and in particular studying antibiotics. And this slide just notes that the research and thinking that I'm presenting has been collaboratively produced through long-term engagement between teams over time. So a lot of our research continued previous collaborations on related topics. And just by way of example, this graphic illustrates the case studies from just two particular research projects, the AMR project and the FIEBRE project, which Paul just mentioned. But additionally, we had members of our group with nested and associated studies, which helped to build up quite a rounded picture of the biosocial lives of antibiotics in different places and spaces. So you can see across just these 5 countries, we had people carrying out case studies, and each of these dots is a different case study led by a different anthropologist member of our team. And then we did comparative studies across these different cases. Yeah, in obviously in African and Asian settings. And this is a list of our antimicrobials in society, the AMIS team, and this was in Uganda and Thailand. This is a list in Thailand in 2018. And this is a list of the social scientists involved in the FIEBRE project, which is in Malawi and Zimbabwe and Myanmar. It's really important also to say that a lot of the work that we've done can't be done without collaborations beyond the borders of anthropology, and understanding the biosocial lives of these medicines really has required us to engage a lot with different disciplines, not only microbiologists and clinicians and veterinarians, but also historians, economists, geographers, environmental scientists, and more. So a huge thank you to all of our collaborators in building this work together. And as I was saying, a lot of our research is really built from other areas of interest, diagnostics and healthcare improvement programs, multi-species relations, the Anthropocene, and so on. So our research focus really has emerged from wider concerns about global health today. But if we think about how people have thought about antibiotics so far from a social science perspective, we have this picture made to kind of represent when we did a big review of social research on antibiotic use and recommendations for antibiotic use. And one of the largest areas, or the largest area of research that's been done in social sciences so far has really been around the cognitive decision making of a clinician or a patient, and here we're trying to convey in the middle somebody who could be either a patient or a clinician trying to decide whether they're going to use an antibiotic or not. And we were trying to convey here is what's often seen as that kind of concentric circle or onion diagram, where you have somebody's individual thinking at the center of it, and then these influencing factors that go around it. So maybe it's, well, I'm trying to decide this, but the lab's closed. I'm trying to decide this, but I know there's nothing in the pharmacy. Or I'm receiving incentives from a drug rep, or I'm worried about what my colleagues might think, or I'm concerned that the queue is so long. I'm concerned that patients might not come back again. I'm also aware that we've got a campaign to save our antibiotics. So all of these different influences on somebody's practice. Whilst recognising the value of the contributions of these many studies that have taken this approach, we also wanted to get beyond putting human and individual human thinking at the centre of our framework and centre of our thinking. This is very, very common and popular in public health and in global health, but there is a big move, and there has been for the last few decades, in the social sciences to de-centre the human and to de-centre cognitive, thinking as the centre of how we understand how the social world works. So we wanted to expand beyond that to see how antibiotic use is a product of wider social, political and economic processes. Sorry, I'm running out of breath because of the COVID. So to do this, we followed antibiotics, we followed care, and we followed AMR science and policy across places and scales. So in each of our ethnographic cases, we were looking at practice, but we were also trying to see what becomes common sense and what the consequences of that are at a local level, and also following connections and making visible the forms and the nature of different relations across different spaces, and also following discourses. So that is looking at the way that metaphors, imaginaries and histories can be made apparent in our analyses. And hopefully I can exemplify that today. To do that, the research methods have involved ethnography, which is a form of immersive observation, often participant observation, tracing different stories and histories, and interviews, of course, and repeat interviews, as well as a lot of documentary analysis, and that's archival, looking at media, policy, looking at programs, and we've done surveys, so large drug bag surveys, for example, with residents and with farmers. A lot of our work is, One Health, so working across different places where antibiotics are used. And also we've used these feedback dialogues all the way through our research to cross-check what we're learning and to share our findings and to enhance our understanding and check the resonance of what we're finding with our participants. So this slide, which indicates our quest for human mastery over nature, is to signal that when we're doing anthropological research, we're considering the tracks into which our field of study is shaped by past and present ways of thinking and organising our knowledge and visions of the world. The first image is of Paul Ehrlich, who coined the term magic bullets at a time when it was thought to be possible to purify the human body. So his idea was that we could have this idea called antibiotics that would go in and only kill those bad cells, and that it would leave everything else in the body. And it was part of this quest to purify bodies from microbes, which of course we now recognise that our bodies are made up of microbes. And this second image, which I've taken from Steve Hinchliffe's and colleagues' book, Pathological Lives, I think is a really nice illustration. You could spend some time looking at it, of the number of dimensions of the imaginaries of public health efforts, and what and who is inside and outside, and how this wall is intended to work. So these are examples, examples of the ways that medicines and public health have been set up. And as anthropologists, we're committed to considering how these ways of thinking tie into how we imagine AMR, what we consider is possible, and what we're envisioning for the future, and how we think about microbes, solutions, and who has authoritative knowledge, and who and what is to be protected. It's also worth pointing to the value of understanding the history of how antibiotics have come to take on their infrastructural role. So, for example, with this nested project, we've carried out our archival work led by Paula Palanca-Lopez within 3 of our ongoing ethnographic study sites to understand how antibiotics had arrived. And we looked at this for both humans and animals. And when antibiotics arrived in colonized territories, they became part of colonial governance and the management of populations, enabling or making more efficient the control of people's bodies and movements. The mass wars and syphilis campaigns promoted by colonial authorities and international organizations are a good example of how this population management was enacted. Both missionaries and settlers considered that biomedical technologies in general and antibiotics in particular would open the door to Western ways of behavior and smooth the civilization process that would, among other things, ward off evil practices of witchcraft and charlatanism. From this perspective, the war against venereal disease in general, and syphilis in particular, appears paradigmatic, almost like a metaphor of these broader aims of getting rid of primitivism and sinful practices among African populations that Megan Vaughan has described a long time back. Consequently, it also became a matter of stabilising the imperial project within the different African settings. It was also part of a particular rationalising idea of how these medicines could be used to shore up productivity, thus forming a connection that has lasted through the decade. Antibiotics thus enabled development in multiple forms, creating citizens with new developed civilized identities and aspirations, and creating new populations inured against disease. So now I want to turn, so that piece of work was in Uganda and Malawi and Zimbabwe, and I'm going to focus now into some case studies in Uganda. So the 3 case studies that we carried out as part of the AMR project were in Kampala city within in Namwango, which is an informal settlement area, Tororo district, which is on the border with Kenya, which is a rural area, and that's where I took this photo, and Wakiso, which surrounds Kampala and is a peri-urban area with rapid industrialization, particularly rapid growth of the agricultural sector and farming. And this is our lead team. So Susan on the left carried out the research and led the research across the studies, and particularly in Tororo. Christine carried out the research in Kampala and Namwango informal settlement, and Miriam carried out the research in Wakiso in the farms and the pig and poultry farm sector. And this involved the research methods that I had already outlined. One of the things that, one of the threads that we found that took, that made sense across our different cases, and is very different in each of those cases, the way that antibiotics are being used, was this idea of entrepreneurship. So I just want to start by putting you in the picture of how this is operating in Uganda. And I think it's really important to take every case as it on its own terms. So at his swearing-in speech in May 2021, President Museveni highlighted key areas where Ugandans can take advantage of opportunities for wealth creation. Reaching thousands of Ugandans through local radio and television, the president's speech consolidated decades of his push towards wealth creation. In Uganda, a statistic that is widely quoted with pride is that the country is the most entrepreneurial in the world, with 28% of adults owning or co-owning a new business. Ugandans are encouraged to join the national drive for socio-economic development by tapping into available opportunities and starting income-generating projects, aiming to transform Uganda into a modern, independent, resilient and self-sustaining economy. After the first years of President Museveni's leadership from 1986, when his focus was on restoring security and economic stabilisation following years of civil war, the 1990s saw a shift towards a new poverty alleviation agenda. During the '96 campaign, President Museveni used the slogan "Kulambeka," translated as tapping wealth, to promote the idea that rain was free water only if the people tapped Kulambeka it from their roofs. Likewise, economic prosperity was accessible to all if only they took advantage of opportunities. Sequential government strategies have shaped this framing. In 2013, these programmes were pieced together into a broader ambition when the President launched Operation Wealth Creation. This government-funded programme aims to facilitate national socio-economic transformation, focusing on not only transforming the economy, but transforming the mindsets of subsistence farmers in order to see them embrace the money economy and to raise household incomes through commercial farming. The Operation Wealth Creation programme aims to achieve development and modernisation in a context of severe economic uncertainty, high prices of consumer goods and escalating expenditures for basic services. Why does this matter for antimicrobial resistance? In our ethnographic case studies, we found that antibiotic use was connected to this vision, this milieu. We found that Ugandans in 3 different areas of the country have attempted to tap into various opportunities, demonstrating how efforts to become commercially and financially independent individuals and households are experienced. In doing so, this research shows how productivity, an emblem of modernity and progress, is enabled through the use of medicines in low-income rural households and low-income urban households, showing how entrepreneurship, the drive for wealth, and the activity of tapping itself are all tied up in medicine use amidst precarious landscapes. To go into the case studies, first of all, we'll visit Tororo, which is the study that Susan was leading on. This whole family is taking this medicine, Harriet explains as she shows Susan the packet of amoxicillin cloxacillin that she's stored in her house. A wife and primary caretaker of 7 children and 2 grandchildren, Harriet is organised and meticulous. She always ensures that she is enrolled in government and non-government farming opportunities. She participates in available clinical research projects in the area, and she installed a solar panel system in her house, enabling her to start a home business charging mobile phones for a fee. This is on top of her other small enterprise, providing care for animals belonging to relatives. Living on less than $1 a day, Harriet is one of the 19% of Ugandans living in extreme poverty. But she appears to personify Ugandan President Museveni's vision for an opportunity-poised population who kulambeka, they tap wealth in the way that rainwater is captured for consumption. Here, kulambeka has become not only an economic imperative, but a social expectation repeated through radio, newspaper, church, and development channels. To be understood to be tapping opportunities that come one's way is to be a good Ugandan citizen, fulfilling one's duty to oneself, family, and the country. The social milieu created by this orientation seeps into Harriet's and others' whole ways of being in the world, from economics to politics to health. It also, we argue in this article, feeds into the ways in which rural Ugandans relate to and use medicinal drugs, antibiotics included. Tororo district on the border with Kenya is the poorest region in Uganda, according to the Ugandan Bureau of Statistics. The economy is described as predominantly agricultural, with 70% of people categorised as subsistence farmers. The chronic situation of lack of money, combined with poor education and health indicators, which show no sign of improvements in recent decades, contrasts with reports elsewhere in the country of remarkable economic growth and poverty reduction. These contrasts reflect the marginalisation of eastern Uganda that can be traced back to the north-south division of Uganda by British colonialists in the early 1900s. Eastern Uganda was considered a labour reservoir and was neglected when infrastructure and social services were developed and assets distributed. This division has continued in subsequent decades, with ethnic groups from the southern part of Uganda dominating the economic and political sectors, while the northerners are stereotyped as best suited for so-called menial jobs such as domestic work and working as security guards and farm labourers. In practice, being labelled agricultural then disguises a range of small-scale activities pursued by residents for their survival. Here, the discourse of tapping opportunities is translated into a way of life that seeks scarce opportunities across a landscape of family and wider social networks, international agencies, and health and climate dynamics. Our fieldwork documented the daily struggles of many families to meet their basic needs of food, health, and education. And most families that we observed ate one meal a day, had access to clean water was limited, with most people dependent on unprotected wells fed by humans and animals. Whilst residents were tuned into the pursuit of opportunities to meet the financial demands of daily life in modern Uganda, not all opportunities were equally accessible, and many failed in their pursuits along the way, causing further hardships. Indeed, spending time with Harriet and her family revealed the constant effort required to navigate life in rural households under this rubric of wealth tapping, or of constantly being expected to be seeking opportunities. When the groundnuts that Harriet and her family planted failed to grow because of the prolonged dry season, they found ways to repay the loan from digging for people at a fee. When the animals she'd been caring for were stolen, she borrowed money from the village savings group to replace them and opted to sleep with the animals in the house at night in order to avoid similar losses in the future. When her family members required treatment, they used the money raised from the sale of groundnut harvest to pay and shared medicines from other illnesses. Residents spent long hours bending over whilst doing their garden work, often resulting in pain in the lower back. In such cases, one of the nurses explained that antibiotics were often prescribed in addition to painkillers to treat possible infections. She explained that local residents commonly stocked the medicines at home, including previously prescribed antibiotics, which were often used to manage pain, saying that some will say, I heard that they have brought the drugs to the government health centre. Let me go and I'll pick them. Now the day he receives some pain is when he will take them. Through this practice, antibiotics had become a routine treatment for pain, enabling garden work to continue. We detailed many similar stories of the use of antibiotics to manage everyday life and documented how people understood the link between their gastrointestinal symptoms and unclean water, for which again antibiotics were a solution. We found the use of antibiotics can also enable people to live and work within inequitable spaces in Uganda and enable a modern life by speeding up the recovery and making it possible for people to get back to work. Our findings suggest that antibiotics became essential for coping with uncertain economic opportunities in rural households, including a lack of quality health services, inadequate sanitation, and a lack of clean water. Antibiotics were playing key roles in mitigating the many risks encountered in everyday life, serving as an opportunity in themselves and a vehicle through which to continue to tap other opportunities in modern Ugandan life. Shifting now to a different setting, urban Kampala, and this is on a particularly sunny day. Namwongo, where the river is low, importantly, this river floods right the way up and goes up to where you can see on the left those houses where they've got those watermarks. It goes right up that high after the rain. Namwongo is one of several informal settlements within the capital, and it's situated alongside a channel which acts as the main water artery that carries water and other waste from the city to Lake Victoria, and which often floods in the rains, bringing water to waste to knee-high into the houses, and which from time to time collapse with this flooding. The land itself is reclaimed wetland. Here, infectious diseases, including cholera and other diarrhea-related illnesses, are an ongoing concern linked to poor water and sanitation infrastructures. A diverse population inhabits Namwongo, including long-term residents and more transitory migrants from across Uganda and neighbouring countries. Despite the daily challenges for its residents, the settlement has a long history in the city and is a popular space where it's possible to find affordable housing, to connect with others in the community and locate labour networks and opportunities. Namwongo is often negatively depicted as a slum and characterised by outsiders as a space of violence and criminality where people are illegally squatting. In 1986, there was an attempt made at slum upgrading, but the project had the effect of pushing the poorest into worse off areas of wetland, extending this settlement and further stigmatising them as illegal squatters. And the consequences of this failed project and subsequent attempts still linger today. Globally, the health and well-being of those living in informal settlements is often poor due to limited access to safe and secure housing, a lack of land rights, limited and inadequate infrastructures, and ongoing political marginalisation. Amid these constraints, informal settlements have the potential to become settings for a vicious cycle of infection and resistance. Broken or non-existent urban sanitation systems lead to greater incidence of infection and disease, which leads to increased antibiotic use, which leads to increased antimicrobial resistance. And in this research, we explored how antibiotics became a linchpin in enabling the inequality that is etched into this informal settlement. Diana, a young woman in her 20s, held out her wounded leg to Christine, revealing an injury she'd sustained in a motorcycle accident a few days prior. In the dry heat of the day, standing on the side road that connected the informal community Namwongo with a busy access road in Kampala, she explained that she now had a fever as well, a side effect, it seemed, from her wound. Showing the wound, she said that a friend of hers had recommended a course of the black and purple capsule antibiotics as treatment. She didn't know the name of the antibiotics she was taking, but from our experience with the antibiotic surveying community a few months earlier, we believe them to be ampicillin cloxacillin. She also mentioned 4 red and black capsules that she'd managed to purchase the day before, explaining she was buying each day's course of these medicines from a local drug shop, but only on the days that she could afford them. Working a number of informal jobs, washing clothes and making food for builders at a nearby building site, she explained that she was rarely able to find work each day. But when she can, she plans to buy more antibiotics to treat what she, in consultation with a local drug shop owner, had determined was an infection in her leg wound. Over the course of the conversation, she expressed what she was most worried about was the fever becoming too severe to be able to work. If that happened, she said, she wouldn't be able to afford more medicine and recovery would be even more challenging. For Diana, precarious work, recovery and antibiotics were intertwined issues that could not easily be disentangled from each other. Across the settlement, we found that antibiotics were used very frequently. Of the 350-day wage labourers that we surveyed, over a third of them reported antibiotics use in the last week. Approaching half of those reported using metronidazole tablets the last time they used an antibiotic. This was often used in connection with diarrhea and stomach pain, used for the duration of the episode and then stored for the next one, typically used for a few days. The ability to access toilets was very poor here. The lack of legal status and ongoing threats of removal lay at the centre of chronic infrastructural issues related to toileting. Throughout the settlement, there is a significant shortage in latrines, with few families sharing private latrines, as you can see on the left here, with they're locked up with padlocks. And many more using public toilets, for which they would have to pay about 200 shillings or 5 US cents, funding which was either often unavailable for every toilet trip or needed for other things. In addition, most toilets were in poor order, and participants reported dissatisfaction with the Kampala City Council Authority, the KCCA, over the lack of reliable servicing and emptying of community and household latrines. Many therefore employed home bucket systems and the use of polythene bags or flying toilets, you can imagine that. A woman with a young family who worked as an informal vendor described the multiple ways that one could choose to spend that 200 shillings, from an onion to flavour a meal, to a matchbox necessary for cooking. Spending it on latrine access, she noted, would mean sacrificing spending it elsewhere. An additional problem was frequently expressed that public latrines were not open throughout the night, and leaving the home at night was unsafe for them and their children. Thus, buckets and bags were the only options, and these would then be emptied into the channel in the morning. This compounded the hygiene challenges for households in multiple ways, including when the dirty water would flood into the houses from the channel during the rains. And as you can see here, I took this photo on the day after a flood had just retreated back into the channel. And you can see all of this waste, all of this rubbish had come up and had swirled around in people's houses. And you've got little kids who they're just sort of head height walking in this wastewater that is just inside their houses. So keeping healthy here is a serious challenge. And here antibiotics came to enable people to continue to even live. I'm shifting now briefly to Wakiso. where we're looking at the farming sector. Jose Bianchia, a retired public servant in his late 50s, is now a poultry farm owner. Without much hope for a paid job, he invested his retirement benefits when he learned of the lucrative business of exotic poultry farming. Equipped with no experience in exotic animal production, a day's crash course at the famous and successful poultry farm provided a snapshot into establishing a farm. His farm sits on 2 acres of land stretching inward from a busy Marham road, land he purchased 5 years ago for this purpose. The land was an ancestral home for a previous owner who sold it and relocated. Its proximity to the road network and other poultry farms meant easy access to raw materials. In addition, the land was a bush of shrubs with tall grasses. So initially it was a bush of shrubs with tall grasses, and now 2,000 brown laying chickens are raised here in a double-storey corrugated iron sheet structures. He's always preoccupied with the status of his chickens. With these exotic breeds, he knows that they are vulnerable to infection as well as to theft. Jose Bianchia pays close attention to their behaviour, listening to their chuckling, observing their agility, monitoring their droppings, watching their feeding and egg-laying pattern. Changes in any of these signs could mean infection. So Wakiso, as I said, is a peri-urban district surrounding Kampala, and is now a top producer of exotic pig and poultry products in Uganda. This idea of them being exotic means that they've come from outside. And the nature of farming here, we've described as quick farming. This is a change to farming on smaller plots with more animals, using exotic breeds, concentrates, and antibiotics. And this has emerged through a recent shift with a promise that is constituted across different spaces. The promise includes this emphasis on entrepreneurial poverty reduction, financial and regulatory incentives for private investment, opportunities for input sales, and a discourse of demand for protein. The farms that we visited kept between 11 to 30 pigs and 500 to 5,000 birds. And most of the participants, that's 83 of our 115 farmers, were farm owners, and many were relatively new to the business. The majority were aged 40 to 50 years, and most had attained a secondary school education and had been engaged in other activities prior to coming into farming. Over half had managed to obtain some informal training on identifying and managing livestock illnesses. But they described living on razor-thin margins. You can make a profit or you can lose everything in each cycle. And it was a high-risk activity. The theft of your animals was huge, and the security was a really big issue, particularly recently during COVID. Disease and biosecurity, however, were a huge problem as well, but also market fluctuation. And we found it hard to see this demand that was in the discourse for the protein, because it was so difficult for people to actually sell their animals for meat. People were also very affected by climate fluctuation and challenges with the employment of staff. A mitigation against all of these risks was much harder than people had expected. The reality really didn't live up to the promise. And the promise is like this: you can harvest money. This is the Harvest Money Expo 2019. And you can see this idea, which is also on many television programs and is really perpetuated in the general media, that going into small-scale farming is a really can be a lucrative business. And small-scale farmers were adopting these commercial techniques, but also shouldering huge risks in doing so. Antibiotic use was very high in Wakiso. Our survey shows a much higher use than in Nagongera, that's in the Tororo study site, and use of drugs that we probably wouldn't want to see being used on an everyday basis. But really, antibiotics here were seen as essential as a form of protection. Without antibiotics, you'd be risking the business, because we keep these birds as part of getting money, and it's a business where we put our money. So we put more to boost our income, and it's like leaving your food outside for robbers to come and take it. Then you're not serious. So we have to minimize our losses. We have to keep everything, and so that you can get the profit outcome of the business. You must take care. Otherwise, without anything can come, like bacterial diseases. And if they come and wash away all the birds in the house, so if you have 1,000, you can remain with one bird. So this, we heard very strongly that people needed to use antibiotics, and they were using them as a preventative and a form of protection. And we saw this as part of a challenge of this kind of promissory assemblage of the peri-urban. And this was kind of embedded as well with this vision of the state for people to Becker, to catch these opportunities. And we found it very interesting that people didn't talk in terms of failure, but it was just the idea that you would keep trying again and keep trying again. And antibiotics became a part of the architecture for being able to continue to try to make a profit out of these enterprises. So, thinking about a conclusion, these studies exemplify how anthropological research situates phenomena such as high use of antibiotics in a much wider frame, such that we could step aside and even critique the dominant framing of why this is happening, which has often revolved around ignorance and a knowledge deficit, which has its own political economy, and instead identify other reasons that the phenomena came into being. One example across these three cases, these three diverse spaces, is that they demonstrate how entrepreneurship infiltrates social relations, citizenship, and notions of the self. And this is just one particular thread I wanted to pull today, but there are a number of other areas of commonality between these three different case studies. But questions then arise for what we might do about this, and I'll come to this in a moment. But first, we need to think about how we can shift our perspective on the understanding and framing of the problem. And we really need to think about whether we should follow the global health calls that are appear to be increasingly about protecting medicines, and think about whether that's a means or an end, and whether we should really be thinking about protecting people and remembering that protecting medicines is on that pathway. So we looked at, as I said before, we looked at the ways that other people in social science have been looking at antibiotic use and how to address it. And the practices in this corner here was the dominant framing. And I mentioned earlier also structures when we were talking about the quick fix. But also it's important to look at the networks, the connections that are formed between different places and the flows of antibiotics, and the ways that antibiotics are written into wider imperatives that make up global health and development. So here we have the global burden of antimicrobial resistance, and as you can see, and you're all familiar with, we have quite a difference in different places around the world in these estimates. But what did the anthropological research that I was presenting make us ask? Well, we might ask who is shouldering this burden, and we might ask how this burden is being experienced. And we might ask of the experiences of the current targets of interventions, the nurses, the mothers, and what's the consequence of being a target of those interventions. And in another talk, we could also talk about stewardship, and in particular, I'm interested in the way that that overlaps with evangelism, for example, but we don't have time about that today. So it becomes clear from these observational studies then that we need to rely less on antibiotics in our societies, and this may mean reinvesting in some of the structures, physical and economic, that antibiotics have come to be a shortcut to avoid investing in. These might include those that reduce transmission of infection, architecture of buildings, wards, farms, housing, ensuring universal access to safe water and sanitation, and the ability to be hygienic, including in food preparation and markets. They might also include looking at the support systems that enable people to take time off when they and their dependents need to recover, rather than overusing antibiotics, and the measures that ensure adequate nutrition that enable good immunity. Measures can also include looking at the ways that patients are followed up or not in systems that mean antibiotics may not be so relied upon as a cover for lack of ability to see patients again once they leave the facility. And of course, prevention of infection through vaccination is one measure that can help with specific diseases. In addition, because of the ways our global systems have become entangled with antibiotics, we need to look at the expectations placed on workers as well as animals whose productivity hinges on antibiotics. Here, we might also consider the consequences and rationales for the standardization in trade that at times relies on antimicrobials. So this is all to say that we can recognise that our time with antimicrobials is running out, but I'm arguing that we not only need to invest in the development of new antimicrobials, but we need to learn to live how we're going to live without them. We need to learn and we need to plan. From what I've outlined, we can see that antimicrobial resistance is a problem that cannot be addressed by hoping to replace failing antibiotics with new ones. This would be the best way to maintain the status quo, but it's inevitable that microbial communities will evolve to avoid the effects of new antibiotics, as they have done with past drugs. It's therefore imperative that our societies become resilient to this threat and able to thrive without antibiotics as a linchpin in so many sectors. This can be seen as an opportunity. It enables different ways of working, living, and trading. But every such change entails trade-offs and must be set in a wider policy landscape. This requires careful investigation across the science to policy pathway, which means engaging across multiple disciplines and expertise with a strategic planning approach that ensures that the actions taken moving forward address and do not create further inequalities that lie at the root of much of the burden of AMR. This image shows the Global AMR Research and Development Hub dashboard, which provides a snapshot of funding on AMR. Over 10.5 billion euros has been invested, and a majority of this funding goes into basic science, new therapeutics and diagnostics. Less than 1% of funding has been spent on policy research. Greater emphasis must now go into identifying the systemic solutions to AMR that will enable populations to manage without such deep-seated reliance on the quick fix of antimicrobials, both today and in the future. Just a last couple of slides to show some resources from the Antimicrobials and Society website. I haven't updated it for a long time, but there are some really useful resources there for those who might be interested in this. And we did make a report on addressing antibiotic use, which emerged from a series of webinars, which you can also watch back on this website under the events page. And also there's some really nice videos made by our teams on the AMIS project. This one includes all 3 case studies that I've just described in Uganda. And these are 2 different films from Thailand, from our Thai study, one in the urban setting and one talking about the anthropology of science and policy. And you can also watch back our webinar series of different presentations from across social scientists working on antimicrobial resistance. Thank you very much, and thanks for your patience.
Claire, thanks so much for that. So we've got about 18, 20 people here in the room, which you can't see because I've put our camera off because it's flickering. And you can, I'm sure you can see that there's another 20 or so people online. So we've got a load of people here. So I guess the obvious thing is people will want to ask questions. Can people online use the hand up function, as I'm sure everybody's familiar with, and we'll try and keep track of who you are and who wants to ask from this end. And then in the room, people also, if you can pull, you can also keep an eye on the room, and then we can manage that. But so I can see a first hand up. I can't, it's Thomas Kesterman. So why don't you ask your